We reconvene our meeting. We have a little delay, but this roundtable will last until 2 o'clock, 14 p.m. After the proposal posed by Professor Sandberg that some of you already knew. For others, as I've seen, it has been something new, and it's surprising the first time you listen to which is transhumanism and its goals, etc. But time has come. We wanted to bring a transhumanist to be with us for him to explain, and some of the issues have popped up, both in the questions and in our minds. So now we are going to go into depth in different aspects of this current, but in this roundtable, although we will not be able to approach them all from the point, because this is dedicated to the cultural, historical, and philosophical analysis of transhumanism, we will not being able to be exhaustive. We're not going to be touching on all the fronts. And throughout these days, Professor Marcos Arana, in his conclusion, and Torralba as well, will talk about different aspects. But in this panel, we are going to be facing to show which are the historical genesis where this comes from, how it understands human being and its nature, the relation between the mind and the brain, because from there, other issues, bioethical issues, will depend on that, legal, scientific issues, and in so many other aspects that will be touching during those 2 days. We've got 3 fantastic speakers. The 3 of them are philosophers, and they're going to approach the issue from different aspects. We have Professor Ángel Barahona Plaza. He's doctor in philosophy by the Complutense University in Madrid. He's working as a director of humanities in the Francisco Vitoria University and also in other universities, as the Philosophy University of San Damaso University or Sao Paulo. He's professor in the Faculty of Theology, Juan Pablo II, in Callao, Peru, in the Catholic Center of Theological Studies, Luis de San Diego in Guam, the Redentoris Matris seminars in Japan, Sydney, Managua, Brasilia. He's always teaching elsewhere, online, during his vacations and his holiday. Professor Barahona is a prolific author. He has written 5 books, among them one, What We Can't Speak About, and René Girard, From Science to Faith. He's a great expert in Girardian mimetism. He's married and father of 4 children. Thank you, Ángel, for being here with us. You have the floor. Well, the title of my lecture tries to talk about the advent of the self-built man, self-constructed man, how we reach that. I start with a quotation that's of Hannah Arendt, from the abyss that is opened when the thought is separated from human action. If the knowledge in the sense of knowing how to do things and the thought have been separated forever, then we will be just toys and slaves, not so much of our machines than our practical knowledge, creatures without brain, at the mercy of all the technically possible devices. From a quotation from Nietzsche, Heidegger insists on the same, and quoting Nietzsche and Ditirambo, all gods are dead, now we want the trans man to be living. Thinking this primary way, as Heidegger says, we can say that the sentence says that the mastering on goes from gods to men, and Nietzsche plays the men instead of God. Those who think like that, they don't think about the essence of God. Man can never be in place of God, because the essence of the man is never going to reach the realm of God's essence. But something may happen, on the other hand, comparing with this impossibility, that is much more concerning and troublesome, whose essence we haven't yet been thinking about it yet. And he says that in 1958. The much more concerning refers to take away from human beings by other human beings considered subhumans. Throughout the history of mankind, mankind has known different artifacts and fantastic beings. Culture is mimetic, and its creations imitate nature or fantasy. And this exchange from fantasy and reality is absolutely permanent. The reproductions tried to give life to objects. They tried to create Frankenstein of Mericelli, for instance, that talked about alchemists, that's Corelio Agrippa, that did all of those things, Alberto Magno Paracelso, with the aim of discovering the fabulous elixir of life that could give us immortality. The new technologies collaborate to constructing this type of immortal man. But they do that imposing a reductionist anthropology that doesn't pay tribute to what man feels inside of him. The technique has able to put man in a state of permanent schizophrenia. He doesn't know who he is, son of God, or the result of a blind mechanistic approach, something that has to be solved, but he doesn't know how. When he does that, he is not assisted to base ethics on humanistic values. Try to release men, liberate men by the power of technology, making him a mere tool, makes this an obstacle for its own release and liberation. The man himself falls as a natural entity within this umbrella that makes out of him a thing. The technique subjects the author, mastering him, reducing him to a complex of molecules, surveilling him, in making out of him a thing. When he raises as Icarus a new Prometheus and is about to steal the secret to the gods, he has problems with his wings, or he's chained to be as gods or be as mortals. The debate is still open, as Gilles Lortois says, between technophilic and technophobic agents. This impasse is absolutely unsurmountable. Myth from reality. Transhumanism is the echo of a former narration that deals about life and death of human beings. The appearance to be a scientific success that offers one of the incredible services is disguising what is behind it, fear of death. There is no culture that doesn't look for immortality, although through a never-ending incarnation. Behind all the human wishes is to steal the secret to God. Dorian Gray, Frankenstein, etc. are only variations that do express the desire of men to control death. The search from the eternal youth is a characteristic of the inhabitants of the paradises of all the religions, Mesopotamia, Hindi, Buddhistic, from yoga to all the others, Ator, Yodin in the Vanhal, Sambala from the Buddhists, or the Indic Kalapa, are only one more version of this attempt of looking for immortality. Mythology is monotonous at this respect. This shows the last pretension that is hiding behind transhumanism in the Jewish and Christian universe as well. But as Tolkien says, even the pagan myths that try to express great truths of God from Jewish and Christians have to be sanctified. In the myths of the para-immortal paradises, they are found in all the different mythologies. The place where gods live have the repetition in the Garden of Eden. But in the Genesis, we're going to sanctify the Bible myths. The Eden can't be restored by human will. The pagan mythopoietic tries to infiltrate among us. Transhumanism is the one more version of restoration of the Garden of Eden with new standards, new methods to convert the human park into a paradise. Although using euthanasia or euthanasia as the Nazis or the Democrats, these are always mythomagic formula, psychotechnological, trying to reconstruct Eden, because this echo is always there with us. From the Bible's prophecies we can learn, because there are already attempts of making that, to touch the tree of life or the reconstructing the Babel Tower. This episode is very significant. It represents an attempt of updating a human replica of the Garden of Eden, of idolatry. From this reading from the Mount of Babel, the Tower of Babel, it becomes a permanent image of a mirror, but a reverse image. It's a negative reflection of the original model established by God. The intervention of God in this episode of the Bible doesn't consist in the destruction of the human construction, but is aimed towards the goal itself. It has a preventive nature. Its purpose is to tell mankind about the risk of going beyond the limits. It's necessary to be within the limits of the state of creatures. The narration of Babel's towers doesn't allow us to conclude about the judgment of God or of mankind that has lost the state of grace. After the intervention of God, it's the beginning of the way of life that is the transition between a mythological primordial event and the history that starts from Genesis 12. Going beyond the limits in Genesis, as in Isaiah and all the other prophecies, is related with this passage always. Don't touch the tree of life. One and again, the humans want to touch the sky. They want to steal the immortality of the gods, also in the Bible. But the first attempt is denounced as an idolatric pretension that will lead them to their tradition. But man is always man, and God is always God. The Bible describes the anthropological cruelty. Man has been expelled forever from immortality. The way of return to Eden is protected with swords. The return, the possibility of returning, that is the opportunity of God after being the expulsion of men, is what is expressed by the Jews as Teshuvah. It's not a return to that paradise, as we understand it all from our pagan mythological vision, but return to the relation of friendship with God, not to possessing the paradise or supplanting, taking the place of God. From the blind evolution guided by technique to evolution of the machine. Until now, the evolution had proceeded without intelligence. From now on, it will replace what the nature was doing without knowing it, or due to the preconceived action of man, says Remy Brand, in the kingdom of man. There is no place for the future, so that the future comes as a surprise, an unexpected surprise. We have to cause this future. The humans can't have an improvisation. We don't calculate the perverse effects that are undesired. Either we think that when they come, they will be solved by the power of technique and scientific research that cause them. What I would dare to call the illusion of control is in the minds of all the groups of research worldwide. The dream of a programmable life is the delirium of all that are at the front line of research. In this sense, our prophecy was Adolf Hitler, one of the examples with respect to the fears we have, predicting the arrival of the Superman, a new breed, a race of men that would manipulate nature, an idea that agrees with Martin Heidegger. Heidegger says, I see the essence of the technique in what I call Gestell, word that has been, that is not too fortunate to. The Gestell means that man is created and caused by a power that becomes evident in the essence of the technique, and that he himself is not mastering any longer. To contribute to understanding all this, we can't ask more from the thought. It's philosophy, but philosophy comes to its end. Gestell, the technological makeup of the world, is is more than one term. It is naming the essence of technology that consists in whose power escapes to the power of man, contributes to be it assumed, and is the final task for all philosophy. Technique is considered a prolongation of the hand of the Homo faber that is potentiating the power of this human instrument that allows the hand, having in the hand the modifying tool of the originary conditions given by nature. This anthropological conception of the human being is not perceived as a threat, but as a neutral potentiality. The origin is like that. Technique, religion, and art were always went hand in hand. They have in common to be extensions of the body itself, of the being, instruments that lengthen the nature, the capacity of action and transformation of the human being. But nevertheless, now it's not any longer that is important. The reference is not to capacity empowering machines, but machines that substitute the human of itself and its environment. The machine derived from the technological implementation is autonomous, extrinsic, and replacing. Cain killed Abel with an instrument that lengthens his arm. Nothing to do with the drones, the missiles, the surveillance reaction devices that are perfectly autonomous. In front of the possibility to adhere to this action with the battery of perverse effects of an action that in principle could be positive, and we have in science with the applied technology, it's a fact that Jean-Pierre Dupuy is recognizing, heir of the Jonasian school, from illustrated catastrophism and the heuristic of fear. It recommends to adopt a catastrophistic approach. From Guiter Anderson, the atomic bomb, to Dupuy in the 11th of September, the ratification that our fears have a base foundation can become a heuristic potential and not use the strategy of destruction. I'm going to use a term that Jean-Pierre Dupuy uses that is very interesting, applied to the nuclear war and its possible accidents, but applied to this analysis of transhumanism. Jean-Pierre Dupuy says a new version of this heuristic of fear. If we want to prevent a disaster, it's necessary to believe in its possibility before it happens. The prophecy of fatality is made in order to prevent it from becoming a reality. Borges says the same in a more literary way. The future is unavoidable, but maybe it doesn't happen. In his last work around this possibility of nuclear war, Dupuy talks of the preemption possibility that refers to the game's analysis and dissuasion and preemption. It's sometimes translated as prevention, but it doesn't go into the depth of the term. Empture means in legal language the action of buying before others buy. Related with the strategic language, the attack of the enemy is imminent, it has already started, and we launch our own missiles in order to react to an event where the register of the future is as strong that it's already as if it were the present. It's necessary to give a response, although the attack hasn't taken place. It's a big paradox. Prevention means that the threat that we have to prevent is a possibility in the future that may be probable, very probable even, and that we try to prevent by means of an action that is preventive. There is no paradox in this case. It's very simple. Elsewhere, commenting with respect to Dupuy, says this aspect is essential. Preemption, or launching the first blow, rests in the striking second first. To be the first in striking, in second place, responding before the attack. Translated into our issue, first of all, as what is coming is absolutely unavoidable, let's be ahead of it. And as we know what the consequences are, unavoidable consequences will be there, but there are other people who are running that same race. Let's attack before, and let's win the market share. And thirdly, because all is profit. As we already have experience of what we have seen as perverse effects of technology, let's accept those that will come as if they had already happened. Our authors are not playing to guessing, but to the prospective, resorting to imagination to prevent. That's what they say. They talk about what may be happening in the future. That tells us, in Spanish, it's better to prevent than to cry. But I'm going to make a biblical translation because this passage is also in Noah's before the deluge. It's better to cry today than not crying tomorrow. And this is absolutely developed in Noah's passage. He put ashes on him as in grief. And when they asked him, who has died? He answered, and all those who listened to him were laughing, you are the dead ones. Noé is telling us to do this in order not to have that grief. This is a key to understand what Dupuy says, calls the éclairé, the catastrophisme éclairé. To anticipate the grief by oneself in order to prevent catastrophe or disaster, so that there is nobody there to celebrate the funeral of the mankind. It's very apocalyptic, and that means revelation, not a catastrophe that can't be repaired. The prophecy is not for it to become reality, because for so that it doesn't become possible. The Bible is being ahead and tells us that the apocalyptic destruction is something that men do and not a divine punishment. The human people doesn't allow Yahweh to be kind. Mankind has been able to destroy itself, and indirectly with nuclear war, or indirectly altering the necessary conditions for its survival, as Dupuy would say. Man is prisoner in his own cage, he's his own predator. But the idea that behind transhumanism or ecologism is the issue on which we have to make the repair, because the appearance of the human is considered as a good. And this is what is dangerous. If the species disappears, the creation would go on fantastically, says the transhumanist, giving rise to a new beginning. But the question is there any possibility to salvage man from himself? The road to this is to put the confidence in reason, in the freedom of the human being as a gift that has been received, and give meaning to the suffering, because all transhumanism is scandalized by this suffering. The non-sense of pain, or the expulsion of the paradigmatic significance of the suffering or the cross in religious terms.
So this may be a critical point in history, searching success at all costs, and we multiply success by 1,000 solutions, and this was anticipated by another prophet, such as Ivan Illich in his radical nemesis. We are doomed to fail. Ivan Illich spoke about medicalization of life, which was exemplified by COVID, bioengineering, which forces us to think that we can control our health, and that is our obligation, because that guarantees our happiness when we know that many of you are healthy, but still you are not really very happy. And I'm thinking about myself, right? I am not happy either. We forget that pain purifies you. Pain is a rift through which other elements can get into us. And this is extremely interesting. Trying to save ourselves through technology, we see on the horizon a new revelation to look for an improved and enhanced man, but this is just utopian, and it will lead us to a dystopia. The Pyrrhic solution that is proposed by technoscience is preceded by anguish. Anguish is prior to fear, because anguish is a derivative of not understanding the causes of evil or its consequences. And allowing technology to become morally autonomous is paving the way towards human slavery. Technology will never be an end in itself. It will be just a means, and conceive it as something autonomous means forgetting about the notion of humanity. The enhanced man of the biological era knows what his doom is, namely the impossibility of assigning moral responsibility to any subject subjected to cyber modifications, because his or her freedom is called into question. So the dimension of scatology is questioned, and the concept of hope loses all its meaning. In the same way as you can't judge an animal predator, you can't judge an ad hoc designed man either. We don't have a clue as where we are moving towards, and we don't have a serious scatological model capable of encompassing the future technical production. And humanity is advancing down a suicidal lane. Because, remember the Babel Tower. This passage is not the mythical explanation of the restoration of the social order based on the chaos left behind by the deluge. It is the expression of the idea that man can transcend all the limits imposed to him by his condition of a creature. So, this is all just an attempt of, Babel is a perennial paradigm in history, part of the common undifferentiating language imposed by men as a collective fascism, which has resulted in chaos, violence, and death. And what is that common language that we could update on the basis of this passage? Is the language of technological empiricism, which is shared by the whole world. It's a universal language that makes us feel God. If the myth always entails wisdom, it forces us to be attentive to the construction of this mythical tower, which is the acritical power of technology. I am not denouncing that technologies that want to compensate for specific defects are wrong. I'm just denouncing the wrongful use we are making, trying to offset the inherent shortcomings of man. And this is what is happening is an opportunity, because there's a Laudato Si proposal that can help us add hope to our lives, because biotechnology is really an invitation to realize that the possible solution is to start humbly. And how? Well, by realizing that we are not the owners of nature. Nature is just for us to use. The land is given to us by children. Life is exposed to the irreparable risk of contingency, and for that reason we need to defend it from the root. Current events warn us against the possibility that we may become an endangered species as a result of our irresponsible vanity. We need to be careful with the totalitarian use of technology, and also against the opposite idea. There is a bestseller in Germany, Siegende Erde, A Sing to the Earth, which describes the new life longed by this romanticism, the idea that men should live like animals in a very simple life. I don't have anything to think about. I just live. There's only my breathing that prevails. I move in free nature, and this life has become my fatherland. Now that there's nothing in my head, no wish, no hope, only now am I a man. Or am I an animal or a plant? Well, it responds to a pseudo-mysticism linked with mistrust against technology, which has become something bad. This coincides with the theories of Michael Batchelor, who accused Christianity of the mistrust against technology because our ideas, our Christian ideas, based on the Genesis, referred to a kind of sovereignty over nature, which we have really, and we really went too far with that. So Laudato Si is a really good tool to balance all of these ideas. And we can't be too naive, but Dupuy was saying that what was going to happen to us has already happened, and this has been included in different texts, such as the Dead Sea Roads, which include different natural catastrophes or catastrophes brought about by men themselves. And these are premonitions that call us to convert. And since God loves all of this more than his own plans, we can look aside, because today nothing is going to happen. We can be calm, cool, and collected. And let me finish. Yahweh is always very strict when Israel, in his arrogance, well, is about to change his attitude. Our hope is that he can be merciful when Israel is taken to exile because of the work of those bad people. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias al profesor Barahona.
Thank you very much, Professor Barahona, for this story of cultural genesis, which is so much founded on its Christian roots. And but of course, transhumanism also has post-Christian roots. And I will introduce the next speaker, who will speak about the anthropological foundations of transhumanism. Let me mention something about his CV. He's a professor of philosophy at the Francisco de Vitoria University. He has a PhD in philosophy, and he specializes in atomistic metaphysics. He also holds a PhD by the University of Murcia, and he's got experience in different types of projects. His main fields of interest are the history of medieval thinking, metaphysics, logic, and literature. As I said, he will focus on anthropological aspects and the anthropological foundations of transhumanism. Javier, I don't know whether you can please show my slides on the screen. I just have to say that I had to change my title because a more in-depth reading of transhumanism and the main texts or the main manifestos or the main self-presentations of transhumanism obviate any anthropological foundation. In fact, that is probably the main tenet. There is no real anthropology, and that's why nobody talks about trans-anthropology. People talk about transhumanism, which is a broader term. This investigation, which is an investigation that tries to be a little bit more genealogic of this anthropological or non-anthropological proposal that underlies transhumanism, has found several difficulties. The first one is that the literature that exists on the topic, because there's a lot of literature on the historical origins of transhumanism, a lot of it is apologetic, defending a series of historical roots, a series of authors, both of philosophy and literature. Mr. Sandberg was telling us about Pico de la Mirandola, also Francis Bacon, Nietzsche. So a lot of authors are mentioned, but different reasons. So it's not easy to articulate an evolutional logic for these authors. It's just that some of these authors have some idea that is more or less circumstantially related with the transhumanist movement. Now, people who do not defend or people who criticize the transhumanistic position are in a similar situation, because the roots that you see do not respond so much to a historical or evolutional analysis of thinking, but they rather highlight ideas of utilitarianism or some agnosticism. And once that symptom is detected, a kind of X-ray, a genetic X-ray, is conducted to see how this utilitarianism or this mechanicism or this Gnosticism came about in the transhumanist movement. And then I was struck because there is a very strong defense by transhumanists, especially Max More and Samantha Bittermore. They're trying to rescue enlightened humanism, right? But at the same time as they defend that enlightened humanism, they warn that originality is also very important. They want to be something totally new, which is totally projected towards the future. And that is why they separate themselves from any system that, in their view, may prevent them from projecting themselves against the future. I have analyzed this, and we will see to what extent it is true and to what extent it is not. And then there is a negation of an anthropological basis. If you paid attention to Mr. Sanders' presentation, at no time did he make a definition of what he understands as human, or as what he understands as a human person or human nature. And he never defines them, because in transhumanism there is no formal commitment with any type of anthropology, and this also makes the analysis of the roots of those anthropological notions more difficult. There's also the amplitude of the transhumanist movement, and this is something Mr. Sanders also mentioned. There's all kinds of concerns included, all kinds of projects included, and there is a trend in transhumanism, which is a trend towards leaving aside philosophy in order to embrace a more moral debate, and focusing on a practical understanding of these issues. In this regard, I believe that they are more focused on projects in as much as they can obtain good results in the research and in the development of the technology behind them. But in this big assortment or range of products, which not always have a systematic approach, I was surprised, and Mr. Sandberg said it, there is a seemingly Christian version of transhumanism. This is the first time I've heard it, also a Buddhist version, and this is all very interesting, because in their manifesto, in their formal manifesto, transhumanism rejects religions out of hand. So this makes finding a common root even more difficult. And then the very position that we have seen in Professor Sandberg, which is admirable, having that will to dialogue with just any position, and this, is very interesting. Also, this makes it difficult to digest, or it makes it difficult to unify transhumanism as a single movement. And they also encroach on feminism, ecologism, so the work is really becoming more and more difficult. And then there is a huge diversity of definitions. This was also shown by Professor Sandberg in his presentation. This diversity of definitions is not as naive as it might seem. Of course, there are differences within transhumanism and within the core of transhumanism as to what is understood as transhumanism, and finally the fact that it is an ideological movement, and this is something Professor Sanders also said explicitly at least once during his presentation. So transhumanism is really an ideology, and therefore there's a lot in this ideology, as with other ideologies, a lot of there's too many arbitrary things. Founders see things in a certain way, and they dictate that everybody should see them in a certain way, which is respectable, because they have created the movement and they are free to decide what the movement is and how far the movement can extend. And this ideological exercise reaches some positions that are sometimes paradoxical, such as deciding what is to be understood as scientific, what is to be understood as a scientific method, to what extent they are willing to extend their view of the scientific model, and to what extent they are not willing to allow that method to be applied to other reflections. So, I think that there's two ways of approaching this topic. One of them is from an analytical perspective, which I think other speakers are going to do, which I think is the best way of tackling these types of problems, focusing on specific issues. For example, the mind-brain relationship, which is very interesting and which is at the heart of transhumanism, but it is a very concrete issue that can be analyzed genealogically in an individual way. Also, you could approach the issues of techniques and technologies, where they come from. This is what Professor Angel was mentioning, how they're related with transhumanism. And so you can analyze many different topics, even the idea of a human nature, human being, which is related with transhumanism. What is the history that has led us to that perspective? You can analyze different issues in an analytical way, in a particular way, and reach a series of consequences. What I have tried to do is different, which is a more synthetic analysis. And the model that I used is the model. What I tried to do is, on the basis of the pretense transhumanism to defend enlightened humanism, I have studied notions which all the different notions that are important to transhumanism that have appeared in the different transhumanistic proposals in history, how they agree and how they configure those notions, which are then going to feature in transhumanism. The result of this process is a very broad exercise which leads to more general than individual conclusions, which of course is inaccurate and which is influenced by my limitations, my limited way of understanding these things. But it is also rich because it offers a general overview of how transhumanism sees itself, and be able to contrast these results to see what results from it, and see whether there may be consistencies, whether there's incongruences, etc. That's at least what I've tried to do. The starting point, I think, should be a general conception of humanism, which I don't dare define, but at least in its broader categories we can describe in a certain way. And I would like to defend the figure of Socrates, who explained things very well. So we start by the Socratic principle of know yourself, gnosis auton. And this is a starting point for, what we are, and which it's important to understand who human beings are and what the limits of human beings are, because the discovery of humans reveals that humans are dependent. Humans have shortcomings and limitations. We need for other people to look after us. Other people need to take care of us until we can be finally autonomous. And that autonomy is always very limited and highly relative. And this is a fact. Human beings require others in order to survive and in order to thrive. And in this tension between get to know yourself, who you are, discover your limitations, and what you can aspire to be, your best version, this includes redemption, and the idea of God in this horizon of different possibilities. But what humanism proposes is the possibility of overcoming those limits by accessing large-scale universal values, such as the search of good, the search of truth, the search of beauty, etc. Always contingent on the other or the others. And this is what explains humanism. And within this framework we find central issues such as the relationship between nature and culture, between natural and artificial, between human beings, their limitations and the need to be saved, and the need to go down a personal perfection lane. All of these are issues that feature profusely in transhumanism. Second step, definition of transhumanism and defense of its dependence on enlightenment. This is Max Moore in the picture, but this is not his real surname. It's a surname that he has given himself. This is very transhumanistic. Samantha Moore is also, that's not a real name either. And this rejection of the name you were given follows the logic of this idea behind transhumanism. They define it as philosophies of life, such as, well, you have the text on the speaker is reading the text on the screen.
And human limitations by means of science and technology, guided by life-promoting principles and values.
So this definition is the first definition of the end of the 90s, or the age of well, it was one of the first definitions. Of course, there are others, but I believe that this one defines quite well what transhumanism is. I am delighted because it's consistent with their proposal. At no point do they speak about human nature, human persons, human reality. They speak about human form, human condition. That they do, as if the human characteristic was just a stage in a process, and human limitations. This play is also very important for transhumanism. And then in the philosophical manifesto of transhumanism that you can find in their official website, they say that transhumanism emphasizes the philosophy's roots in enlightened humanism. From here comes the emphasis on progress, its possibility, and desirability, and not its inevitability, on taking personal charge of creating better futures rather than hoping or praying for them to be brought about by supernatural forces, reason, technology, scientific method, and human creativity rather than faith. So, clearly, this is what they understand as humanism, as enlightened humanism. It's interesting, this nuance about the possibility and desirability and not inevitability, this is criticism to Marxist or Hegelian humanism, which understands progress in a more deterministic way. According to them, they speak about extropy as compared with utopia, or extropia as compared with utopia, and I have included 5 proposals. They include rationalism within Enlightenment. This is a decision that makes sense from their point of view, not so much from my point of view, because I can see significant differences between both. But for them, rationalism and Enlightenment, well, this is something that they defend. And it's interesting because they accept from Descartes' commitment with a trend towards absolute rationalism, self-rationalism. Of course, Descartes' commitment with science and overcoming the religious discourse, but they also see that Descartes in the 5th meditation includes a recourse to God as a guarantor for the possibility of connecting humans with reality. So that facet of Descartes they just forget about. But in this same sense, they say that Spinoza, in his theological political treatise, says that we need to break away with this relationship between philosophy and religion, or theology, because philosophy is devoted to the search of truth, and religion should be devoted just to the moral issue. Just the moral issue. Right, so this continues setting aside of theology and religion is for them a value that needs to be respected across the board. Right. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try and speed up. Now, it's very important because in Enlightenment, there's a commitment with glorifying reason, and when you glorify reason, you're not just glorifying human reason, you're glorifying anything that they understand as rational, including the rules of the universe, the physical rules, the physical laws. So they introduce the whole theoretical development of the building of science with its corollaries, deductions. They include it within human rationality. They introduce it within the human interior, and they rule out anything that is real, anything that is biological, physical, in the material sense of the word.
This is radicalized, and then we have the best for God as a projection of human spirit. Well, then, one step beyond, we have absolute humanism of the German idealism from Hegel mainly, that synthesizes somehow in this concept of absolute spirit, they synthesize the human divine nature. Hegel makes this big agnostic exercise of introducing the story of the human salvation as one phase of this progress of the human being towards the absolute spirit, and they propose a human mind that is superior, that is very rich, that has to be even more enriched in an idea of progress that from the point of view of the transhumanists is deterministic. So this aspect should be rejected. But this idea of spiritualizing what is human and the whole valuable content of the human in a sort of absolute mind that is in contrast completely in a dichotomic fashion and dialectically as well with the material, the bodily, and this is included in the logic and rationale of humanistic and everything we've told about the biological support, artificial support of the mind, etc. This synthesis that Hegel achieves is ruled out by the posterity. We find the Hegelian right that tries to rescue all the Christian heritage that they see is at the left of Hegel. So they rule out absolutely everything that has to do with God. And they focus that tension that Hegel identified between what is divine and human in the relation between man and nature. And they define what is human, and this is what is interesting. It will be very interesting to then understand Nietzsche and Sartre adequately, what the exercise of freedom, the human freedom. This exercise of liberty in Marx obviously has to do with the fight of classes and the progress of society towards a utopian goal. But definitely the human more and more will be focused towards the exercise of freedom. And this is away from the existentialist humanism. We have to distinguish there is the Sartrean existentialism, humanism, the great bet for freedom, and then we have the existential bet from Heidegger that is more complex and has a lot to do with the roots of transhumanism, but I'm not going to enter that field due to lack of time. What are the conclusions that I drew from this analysis? The separation by the transhumanism of the classical case of humanists is not real. They do stay in that scheme whether they want it or not, but the tension that this is nature or condition, what we are at present and what we want to become. And what we want to become to be is seen as a progress or an improvement. Then the division between human consciousness, biological or artificial support, this is from the modernity and rationalism, scientific guarantee of truth that makes that sometimes the method of transhumanism, at least in philosophical terms, is a reductionism, mechanicism, and materialism, with the limits, at least as a justification that these reductionism have. And then, paradoxically, we talk about transhumanist philosophy, but as we have seen, the transhumanists are not too much interested in philosophy. They are more interested in the practical issues, the issue of carrying out improvement. The philosophical reflection is there put in a corner in the moral issue, the moral debate, as a consequentialism. And this is what Spinoza did with respect to religion. Let the religion be just in the moral debate. And then the great proposal of extropy against the final causality and utopian constructions that are characteristic from idealism, and that acceptance of undetermined progress, as we've seen, is not anything original, practically. This structure or these ideas can be found throughout this whole human trip. This wish for immortality of being permanent, to transfer the paradise to earth, is also very characteristic from the posterity of the German idealism. And then the self-constructive exercise of freedom. We have overcome the biological evolution, as Sandberg told us, and now we're going to tell you how the evolution will be in the technological aspect. Everything starts from a design, from an exercise that is complete and radical of the freedom itself. So I believe personally that many of the topics that the transhumanism has been dealing with, and this is an evidence that I have seen in these readings, are very extremely interesting for the university. I totally agree with Sandberg at this respect. The open reason that Maria Lacalle proposed, Razón Abierta, is a good platform in order to try to start a dialogue with around all these issues. I believe that transhumanism, as it has been posed as a philosophy by themselves, is not enough bet in order to solve all these fundamental issues. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias por tu análisis.
Thank you very much for your analysis, Javier. It has been very important. And also some specific aspects of anthropology will be dealt with in some of the papers. But you've given us a good scheme of this philosophical and historical genesis. Now we will go over to Professor Ignacio Murillo, that I'm going to present to you. He's professor of philosophy in the Navarra University. He defended his PhD in 1993, directed by Dr. Leonardo Polo. He did many studies, and he has been in several countries as Italy, United Kingdom, Germany, United States. At present, he is teaching philosophical anthropology and social anthropology at the Navarra University. Since 2010, he's directing the brain philosophy, neuroscience in the Culture and Society Institute of the Navarra University. Among the topics that he has been dealing with, the understanding what is specifically human in the setting of scientific knowledge and in dialogue with several philosophical traditions, and also the study of habits and the theoretical aspects of some mental diseases and the relations between anthropology, biology, and technology. In this task, Professor Murillo has paid special attention to the differences between human and animal intelligence, between living beings and machines, and the challenges posed by the transhumanistic approaches. I know the mind and brain work carried out in his university is fantastic. He's going to talk about brain and consciousness in transhumanism. Professor Murillo, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for your introduction and also for your invitation, Professor Elena Postigo. I feel very at ease in this university, both according to the issue and the topic, and also the invitation, the framework of the Institute Razón Abierta, whose interests I share completely, so much so that those interests that you have explained here before at the beginning have made up my own academic career and the way of practicing philosophy. Well, what I'm going to do in this intervention is, well, I'm going to read in order to be briefer, and I'm going to focus on an issue that maybe you can't see it at the beginning, the connection it has with the topics we're dealing with, and also with the title. The title, Brain and Consciousness in Transhumanism, is a title that can be dealt with from many different points of view, but I have chosen one, and I start reading directly. The title of my intervention suggests a fascinating topic that, of course, I will not be able to treat, not even start adequately in the time available. Although, at simple sight, I will separate from it, I propose to point out some limitations of transhumanism that make out of it, in my opinion, in a proposal that is not too realistic. And I will do that supporting on some basic theses to understand the relationship between brain and consciousness. But before starting this task, it's necessary for me to clarify that I understand by transhumanism, the term is defined in different ways, that doctrine that proposes to modify or complete by means of the application of technologies of different kinds to the human being as we know him until now, until we obtain a post-human creature, supposedly better than the one that has to make this initiative and the starting point. So I understand not by transhumanism the fact of attempting to improve technological human being, but obtain something that we can consider different from us. There are many different perplexities proposed by these projects. The first problem is that it seems to presuppose a notion of a delimited enough species, something that is absolutely controversial in current biology. This difficulty of defining species, if we bear in mind biologism with which one normally accomplishes the study of what is human, suggests that for many of the defenders, the name of transhumanism, alluding to the human nature as something well defined that we want to overcome, contains more a provocation towards the Western or humanism that wants to have a clear notion of the human species than a true proposal of being embarked in a greater mode. Anyhow, it's important. It's necessary to ask each one by one, all those that even know the true scope of this enterprise. The emphatic nature of this transhumanist hides a naive conviction about the singularity of the human species, something that already Professor Sandberg had mentioned, what would explain the transcendence attributed to its definitive separation. But let's say that we can apply this name to the project of taking part in human beings, reading the biological evolution, developing prostheses or intelligent machines so that we obtain something that is different enough in order not to be called human and better enough than we in order to be able to congratulate ourselves from this achievement. Let's also say that we can define what means better and for who it is better, especially if the collective agent of this adventure is probably destined to disappear with it, what we consider as humans. It's true that considering these difficulties could give rise to long discussions with respect to the meaning, the possibility, and the convenience of the transhumanistic project. But nevertheless, in this occasion, I'm going to focus on another aspect. May be more difficult to explain, but I believe that due to its relevance, I believe it's worthwhile paying attention to it. I believe that transhumanism, in a conscious or naive manner, presupposes the conviction that a human being with all its skills could be able to be the result of a process of construction or production. This conviction seems to be contained in the transhumanistic idea that we can produce with our genius something superior to the human being as we know him, because the one that can do the most, the superhuman creature, can also do less. That is the human reality. For some, this statement is just obvious because we normally use language of production more and more when we refer to living beings. The extreme case of this use is the discourse accompanying synthetic biology that tends to speak of human beings as if they were engineering products. But without reaching that extreme, the capacity of intervention on the bodies that we have, organisms that we have today, explains that the vision we have of them corresponds more and more to what Descartes made popular. Machines that, although they haven't been produced by man as machines that according to him are, they do contain nothing that prevents them from being made by men. Those that don't see that this conviction is a feature of the transhumanism, I encourage you to think about the relevance that in the transhumanism imaginarium the possibility of designing machines more able than we exist, with intelligences that use cleaner support than ours, and also the decisive role that in this change of species, the hybridization between organisms and machines has, until blurring the limits that may exist between both concepts. So not only the biological intervention is presented as limited, up to the point of presenting what is alive as a product, but it is completed with a vision in which the machines that we produce, without stopping being machines and products, can be able to reach and overcome each one of the properties of living beings. Maybe the present possibilities and the future hopes of technology would be enough to explain that the contemporary vision of the human beings, including ourselves, is conditioned by the idea of production. But there is something more to it. Our vision of the world can't be separated from the history that precedes it, although we are not aware of it. Producing from a prior matter is one of the constants in human species that we can attribute to our since many million years. It's not strange, thus, that production activity may be to divine beings more or less humanized is found in wise old explanations of the origin and properties of the universe. But nevertheless, the ancients were aware of the limits of that image. Living beings are not produced as the results of the human technique, they are generated. That's why if the divinity or nature can give rise to living beings, it's not enough to have a productive capacity as ours, but also to endow the creatures of independence, autonomy, and clarity as well of an intrinsic teleology that are incompatible with the desirable characteristics of any device, that are to be by itself inert, absent of initiative, and responded, it's a metaphor, to the proposals of its designer or user. Living beings have their own goals that obviously, and against what the followers of Bernardino Telesio and Baruch Spinoza say, do not limit to be all self-maintained, because they grow, they reproduce, they evolve, they colonize new ecological niches, and not only does it seem that they don't exist for any specific reason or to cover some lack from the universe, but they deploy an activity that we could call exuberant and free. This gratuity of life is seen particularly in human beings. We don't only look for the good as all the rest of the living beings, but we want to reach happiness, or with a less ambiguous term, the eudaimonia, that in current words could be translated as a good life or existential fullness. Greeks, Romans, Hebrews, and other peoples had some term to design what they distinguishes living beings from the rest of things. Among the Greeks, one of them is psyche, the soul, that is included in the breathing. Another more general, that is physis, the nature, that points out its capacity of being born and growing. Among the philosophers, there were speculations around the characteristics of this principle before Aristotle formulated technically that what we call soul behaves with respect to the matter that the living being shares with the rest of the natural beings as a former principle. The Aristotelic characterization of the living beings, with all their empirical lacks and some theoretical deficiencies, in my opinion, is still the most classical of all that have taken this problem seriously. The living beings carry out perfect actions that possess a goal, and they are thus, in a greater degree, susceptible of good and bad in the strict senses. It's true that the Aristotle's form, at least in some of his works, is something that keeps the consistency, as his master said. That's this characteristic, in my opinion, that can help their critics to ridiculize and try to expel the biology of notion of nature. But this Aristotelic description is, in my opinion, the one that responds to practice of biologists, also the contemporary ones, although the biology philosophers try to rewrite the set of knowledge that make up our knowledge, practicing different forms of intellectual asceticism that force them to do away with goals, nature, substances, acts, or powers. The hylomorphism of Aristotle is accepted when we recognize that saying about natural beings and especially the living beings, that they are a piece of matter, or describe one of its components, the dispensable material, as is not sufficient. Science consists in describing the internal distinctions, inwards and outwards, that belong to each substance. That's why a geneticist could confess recently, I heard him, he told me, that the biologists are interested above anything by forms. We can add that the formal configurations that make a living being to be what it is are not independent of the movements and activities that are carried out in it itself. Aristotle is right when he sustains that life exists in movement, but that life for the living beings is to be, that life is not added to a prior subject, but for those who enjoy life, to be alive is exactly the condition sine qua non of being the subject that they are. In my opinion, it's convenient that the transhumanists take more seriously that we are alive and that life can't be, by definition, the result of a programmed process of production. We can take part in human beings, in living beings, before and after their onset in the germ cells, their development, their constitution, even at a very basic level. But we are unable of creating life. We have to accept it, or in any case wait for it to appear spontaneously. Maybe we could even be able to set the basis for it to appear, but once it arises, it will take the control of the process away from us. This spontaneity corresponds to the control that the living being takes as soon as he starts existing, and with goals that are in constant dialogue with his environment. Because we are alive, no engineering can build us, but only modify or transform. This fact puts clear limits to any attempt of creating something new that works. And that is that either we support on what already exists, and in this case we have to respect and promote its goals, or we try to put the conditions for something new arises without controlling the final reasons due to which it works or doesn't work. The consciousness may be dark of this limitation. It's revealed in the literary narrations and the prognosis of some scientists. Dr. Frankenstein needs the intervention of a lightning independent of his powers so that his creature in a supernatural framework acquires life, and those that predict an artificial intelligence superior to ours recognize that once generated, we can't anticipate what will be their goals. The machine shows its independence in those fictions, starting to have initiative and develop goals that his constructor has not placed on him. Those fantasies that are close to those of the transhumanistic author do not correspond so much to engineering, whose declared goal is to solve problems with efficacy, as to the artistic concerns or creative concerns of the human being. They don't respond simply to the wish of developing things to improve our life. They reflect the aspiration to produce a piece of art that is not only destined to be the object of our contemplation, but that is found at the same time that receives initiative itself. The threshold of this achievement is not placed in life, whose resistance to be produced, as we've said, is overlooked, but it is in consciousness. To be aware of it oneself would represent for our creation to cross the Rubicon that separates some simple machines from the improved offspring of men. Against the reluctances of the previous science that expelled methodically the consciousness of the scientific image of the world, the current scientists tend to consider it one of the challenges of contemporary science. The problem of consciousness suggests in another level the problem that life does present. But I think that to focus on consciousness, forgetting the living condition of the subject that enjoy it, suggests the wrong path for solving the questions that are posed. Consciousness can be dealt with as a phenomenon similar to the force of gravity or electromagnetism that accompanies matter or is generated by some of its configurations in given conditions. At this respect, the phenomenology can remind us that consciousness is not one more phenomenon, but the condition of every phenomenon, but recognizing that its method, although it prescribes, should never be forgotten, and it's not leading to any ontological statement with respect to its place in reality. The root of consciousness in life is not easy to reach if we abandon the naive ontology or spontaneous ontology that is practiced by the biologists, where they are not influenced by some biology, by philosophers. If the living being is not a machine to which we add consciousness, we have to take into account the consciousness among the activities of the human living being. And Aristotle, what we call consciousness includes knowledge, or maybe comes from it. Human beings are not only aware in the sense that as the fishes or chimpanzees may be, because beyond them we take for granted, unless we start just being skeptical, our capacity of knowing what is real as such. Saying as Aristotle, we could wonder why, how is it going to be useful for us to be aware, conscious, if we don't know we are. On the other hand, every scientific enterprise that supports both technological progress and that, although we want to ignore it, we can't forget it. The activity of understanding that, as far as we can carry it out, is configuring the life of the human species, consists in a form of life that goes beyond, due to its reach and amplitude, any material configuration. But nevertheless, we shouldn't doubt that we are organisms, that our consciousness and intelligence have to do more particularly with that set of tissues that we call brain. If we look back to this prodigy of human existence, it's not strange that this topic has given so much thought to the heirs of Estagirita. How to conceive an organic living being whose capacities exceed matter. In spite of this notion of species supported by Aristotle in these characteristics of intelligence, in this way of logos or rationality is the only one that allowed to define one species, the human being. This is not the moment to solve the hard question to reconcile organic life with intellectual life, but nothing prevents us to present this problem to the consideration of those who propose a transhuman future and ask them to tell about how it's going to be. Are we able to produce or generate that type of intelligence? Can we conceive it just as the yield of some device? If the consideration of the soul and the life guides us towards the depths of the material universe, the acceptance of intelligence seems to bring us even further, because it gives us back to a place where we can go beyond it. That's why to be equipped with this type of intelligence is opposing us to the rest of the living beings. What could it mean to produce an intelligence? Could there be an intelligence that is not the activity of a living being? Can we produce the type of living being that carries out as one of its vital activities? As I said at the beginning, it seems that we find some limitations of the transhumanistic dreams that maybe force us to think again about the goals and procedures of a technological intervention affecting the human being. On the one hand, the life as limit of any form of production, and on the other hand, even more radical, our impossibility of sketching at what respect we could produce a true intelligence. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor Murillo, for your intervention and for this approach with respect to the issue of intelligence, consciousness, and brain. Well, I believe that the interventions that you have listened to have given rise to many question marks, at least among the online audience. The speakers did stick to the time. We have half an hour for the discussion. And those who want to ask a question in the room, you can just get up and go to the microphone. We are going to have one online question and one present from the people in the audience. First, then, online question, as nobody's asking for the microphone here right now.
No se te oye. Tenemos nuestro anfitrión de sala.
We have our
Vamos a ver.
host. Let's see.
Anímense a hacer alguna pregunta, si no yo tengo.
Well, I've got some questions. I can ask a couple of questions myself, but we had an online question first.
Y rogaría también, por favor,
And please
brevedad en las
be
preguntas,
brief in the
si es
questions
posible,
and,
porque
if
ya
possible,
estamos.
also in the answers.
Sí, yo creo que ya se me escucha. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The first question comes from Fausto Leonardo Enrique for Dr. Barahona. In the Genesis, God put in front of the Garden of Eden cherubims in order to keep the tree of the life. Habermas, in the future of mankind, expresses his concern in front of the new possibilities of biotechnology because it has gone beyond the threshold of life. In his opinion, what is the path to follow to inspire humans helped by science and technologies looks towards a fuller future? Can we have seraphims that can surveil the tree of life throughout the life?
Fausto ha hecho su tesis doctoral sobre el transhumanismo. Es
Well,
filósofo y teólogo.
Fausto wrote his PhD on transhumanism, so there you go. So then I'm sure that he's a much better expert than I. Well, I don't know. God loves our freedom more than his own plans about us or his own plans for us. His prescriptions never impose any kind of will that is superior to human freedom. His respect for human freedom is absolute. And many of us contribute to destroying this freedom. And I'm not talking about re-inaugurating a physical paradise or a physical heaven. I'm talking about going back to being God's friends and recognizing that our freedom is a gift to, be better persons, or to destroy what we have been given and try and become gods. I think that that is the response I want to give. Thank you very much, Angel. There is a question from the floor. Hello. Thank you to Angel and Jose for their presentations. They were very interesting. I come from Malaga and I wanted to ask Angel whether you don't think that transhumanism may be an attempt to get rid of vulnerability as an element of human nature, and whether in this attempt they are, through these technological innovations, they would be trying to remove this aspect. Well, yes, transhumanism, putting all the trust on arrogance and vanity of science and technology from the point of view of enlightenment, that is the belief that we can eliminate suffering. And that's what I think that what the revelation tells us is that vulnerability expressed as an original sin, or as a tragic flow, or, well, it has been given several names. The fact that man is a precarious creature, but that is precisely what is so wonderful. That is what allows us to help each other and understand each other as human species, and this is what allows us to have a scatological project and think that we have been created to love, to help each other, to love each other, and to create redeemed humanity without that precondition of vulnerability. Well, I would say it is a fantasy, because any attempt to eliminate vulnerability will lead to the multiplication of many other evils, but which are bound to come our way. So I think that vulnerability is an absolutely wonderful anthropological condition that God has given us so that we can feel creatures, and so that we can create this friendship with God, or recreate this friendship with God and go back into the fold. This is what Nietzsche says. If God is dead and we have all become gods, then what awaits us is not heaven, but an ocean of blood cannot be cleaned by all the sponges in the world, right? So if we are gods, then we're only violence awaits us.
Una online vamos a hacer.
There is a question online, yes? Also for Angel.
Es la estrella.
Angel is the star of this panel. Comes from Ana del Valle. She says that in the recent... I can't hear you. Blanca, please. Ana del Valle. In the recent defense of a PhD dissertation, the student was defending the idea that technology should keep moving to conquer sound resolutions that are already superior than our own perception thresholds. And he was saying that the control of humans over technology would reside in managing the way in which our senses must evolve to adapt to new technologies. What is your opinion about this? God hasn't set any limits to us. What we need to calculate are the consequences of our actions on nature and on reality. Anything that means creating, mitigating, improving, extending, without trying to change the human essence, without trying to become gods, invulnerable gods, or perfect gods. Anything that is not that will be welcome. But it is welcome because we have no other way. It's our condition. It's our condition. It's our condition of our freedom. But we have subverted the sovereignty with which we have been conceived as a kind of hierarchical omnipotence that replaces gods. And that is where difficulty comes. But anything that we can do, any innovation we can do, well, is perfectly in line with what Genesis says. At least as far as I'm concerned. Any further contributions? Yes. Well, really, in practice, this is the question. When we speak about human improvement, expanding the capacities of the human being is one of the questions that comes to mind. And what is the relationship that has with technological progress? What makes me a little bit nervous about this approach is why do we have to adapt man to technology when technology is done by man precisely to improve human capacities? And I think that we are in this circumstance now because we are developing technology so that we don't take into account in what ways technologies may help us live better. We set ourselves very specific goals. We develop technologies that can do incredible things, but then it turns out that these technologies condition our lives, and we find ourselves in a technological environment which is inimical to human beings, and this is something that happens all the time. So any proposal that wants to take technological development to its limit is going to come up with these problems, because human beings are also a system, and when something is altered, what you gain in the swings, you lose in the roundabouts. And even if our plasticity is manifested in many aspects, especially in our brains, which are manufactured to learn, and we also have a series of requirements and conditions so that the improvement is really an improvement and not a destruction. Well, when Professor Sandberg was talking, what I was asking myself is, what for? Improve, but what for? Enhance, but what for? Implement that technology, but what for? The Aristotelian goal, right? Because things have been designed to make us owners of technology, but it is technology that needs to adapt to us and not us to technology, because when the instrument, when you manage the instrument, then it makes sense. But when it becomes emancipated, well, machines are automatic, and machines will little by little control more and more things, and that is where danger begins. What for should be the question. Why do we want to enhance? What do they want to enhance, human beings? Thank you all very much for your presentation. I'm Eduardo Garrido. I'm a professor of AI of the Madrid University, and my question has to do with mind, brain. For Mr. Murillo, don't you think it's too anthropological to think that we... Well, don't you think that we should, first of all, think about different things before we can replicate them into a machine? Well, obviously, if we want to replicate something, first of all, we need to know what it is. And the question of conscience or consciousness in the context of contemporary science and of philosophy raises many questions. It is one of the issues of philosophy. It has been so from the origin. And when the problem of the mind, the brain problem arises, I always try to, and it's a deliberate attempt, I always try not to focus just on the problem of conscience, but also consider other human characteristics that are even more important than conscience or consciousness. But the problem is that both human conscience or human self-conscience and human intelligence, we don't really know what the relationship is with the organism that we are part of. What would it mean to replicate our consciousness or our intelligence? Apart from whether this makes sense or not, because creating a self-conscious machine is something that doesn't make any sense. Of course, one might want to do that, as one might want to cover the island of Guam in plastic. So it's an artistic wish, but it is not a need, or it is not anything that will resolve any problem. We can manufacture incredible machines that resolve problems that we can't resolve and that do things that we can't do, but we are, however, geared to resolving the problems of human life, or allowing things that we can't even consider now, but which are aligned with us. So I do agree with the fact that this is a problem, and I think that any effort in that direction of generating self-conscience without knowing very what it is or how it is related with the support it normally acts within, well, we'll have to see what happens. It's not a really very well-directed endeavor. Yes, there is another issue in that respect. I don't know whether it might be interesting. We need to take into account when we talk about self-consciousness from a scientific viewpoint, the development that is achieved will be limited by the method of the science itself. And a phenomenal analysis of the human conscience reveals that it is a concept, a mysterious concept of the human beings, but it is related with many aspects of the human being which are not really cannot really covered by science in a strict sense. Of course, there's the knowledge of your conscience seems to be a previous step to be able to integrate all of that into a machine, but we need to consider, to start with, the question of whether it is possible to acquire this technical or scientific knowledge in this strict sense of the word conscience. I don't think it is possible myself. Again, Fausto Belardo Enriquez, a question for Dr. Ruby and Paula. You said that transhumanism doesn't conduct anthropology or a trans anthropology, but in my view, transhumanism is in itself anthropology, an anthropological model of our days, because it is the human being that is at the center of this system. Don't you think that this is akin to dualistic anthropology? Yeah, a very relevant question. Before saying whether something is anthropological or not, we need to say what we understand by anthropology. What I wanted to say was that the starting point of the reflections of transhumanism on human beings is not really an in-depth study of what the human being is as such, of the human nature. This doesn't really interest them. What they're interested in is what we are able to construct on the basis of the current condition. The fact that they use the word condition is very revealing in this respect, because a condition is something that happens circumstantially at a historical stage. So obviously there are anthropological elements, and there's many of them and very important ones, but they occur in a descriptive way, not as a system, not as a strong thought proposal or as a known system, which is something that we did see in the previous kinds of humanism, but it is more like a descriptive proposal of certain elements which are included and integrated depending on the project itself, depending on what they propose, and not on the basis of a reflection of what human beings are as such. Right, okay, thank you. I'm Breakout Sessions from the University of Navarre. I wanted to ask something that I thought about when I heard what Professor Murillo was saying. It's a linguistic issue, but I think it is important because sometimes language can be tricky. We speak about AI, and we have accepted it, but it is not really intelligence, it's data processing. And the same goes with conscience. The word conscience, we say that machines can gain conscience, but what we're really saying is that machines are going to acquire X, which is not like the same as us. So, since this is at the basis of the analysis of transhumanism, we should analyze whether it might be worth our while, before we keep talking in those terms which are very confusing. We should perhaps establish different terms that might help see the differences, because otherwise we are accepting the machines can have a conscience, and then you say, well, it's not really the same type of conscience. Thank you. I want to say that Professor Marcus is going to talk about precisely that. Artificial intelligence is not really intelligence, and Professor Arana will talk about intelligence tomorrow. Well, we find ourselves with the problem of language. Language is a given, and the discourse of AI comes from the past. But it is also true that we don't just have to discuss with AI followers. We also have to discuss with the thought traditions that identify intelligence with what AI followers call intelligence. So it is a discussion not just with AI and its supporters or followers, but with anybody who has a similar view of what intelligence is. But terminological problems are something that philosophy knows that they are unavoidable, because language is very general. And something similar happens with conscience, because from being a human attribute, it has extended. And if we look at classical psychology, there is sensitive conscience. Some people say that animals have feelings, but then, of course, there's a big difference between all of that and what happens in human beings. There's a quantum leap. Some people speak about the knowledge of animals, and they speak about intelligence in human beings, but there is a very big quantum leap, even if some people call those things knowledge. But some people say, no, what animals do is not knowledge. Only science entails knowledge. But, there's quite a few things to be said. I would like to add something that I think is relevant here. All the attempts that have been made to put an end to metaphysics, and the first one was mentioned already, or of saying this is the end of philosophy, what all of that heralds is a new metaphysics with a new language which is unfathomable, and it needs to be learned. It's like when you study Zubiri, you need to learn a new language, and translating that language to make it understandable is very difficult. So when, in the name of science, you say we need to abolish metaphysics to tackle these problems, well, this is done from a metaphysical perspective, but that is a very big problem. Yeah, I think that you're entirely right in the sense that we need to be careful with language, in as much as assuming a certain language entails assuming a certain position, which is not really valid as a starting point. But as Dr. Murillo was saying, when a certain language has been accepted in a cultural debate, which is global, what needs to be done is distinguish, make a distinction and see what do I understand by this, what do you understand by this, and see what the differences are and what the common ground is. That it's challenging, but it needs to be done. There is one last question for the whole panel. We have done a lot to measure human intelligence, at least intelligence that does engineering work. Do you think that that kind of intelligence can be put at the service of measuring the level of human consciousness? What is the relationship between consciousness and the view people have on reality? Would anybody like to answer this question? Has Ignacio? Repeat. The question is whether you think that intelligence will be put at the service of measuring the level of human conscience. Measure the level of human conscience, you say. Well, we will see what you understand by measuring the level of human conscience. But there is a whole discussion. In fact, now there are some theories about conscience that seek to find measures of the level of conscience, or what the basic conditions are of a system to say that it is a conscious system. For example, the theory of integrated information by Dononi, and they're applicable. They're applicable because, for example, in neuroscience, or when we talk about people in a coma or people that have no conscience, sometimes we don't know whether the person has no conscience because they can't do anything, or whether they just can't express what they want to do. And, for example, these types of things are sometimes applied. So technology might tell you what conditions must be met by the brain so that there may be conscience. If that is the question, then I wouldn't exclude it in the future, but I don't really know whether the theory of integrated information is going to provide a solution for this problem. But I do think that it does underscore interesting issues. That is what I would like to say. About the last issue, I don't know whether it got you right, but I think that one could say that precisely, given the relationship between consciousness and human knowledge, generally speaking, any theory, any gnoseological theory includes a reflection of what awareness is, or the nature of awareness, and This is something that we see very clearly, at least
lo que entiende el realismo por conciencia, lo que entienden idealismos o incluso posturas más
in positions such as idealism, realism, or rather theories on conscience, philosophically speaking. And this, of course, is related with the way you understand the world. So there is a relationship between your definition of what conscience is and the way you conceive the world. Part of my question was answered because it had to do with language. My second question is, if transhumanism, well, perhaps transhumanism helps us investigate what is specifically human. What are the specifically human traits? And my question is whether perhaps surprise may be a meeting point for transhumanism, because whether we might reach a common ground, a broader common ground, on a more solid anthropological base, devoid of emotionalism. That question is for you, Jose Ignacio. You're passing the buck. No. Well, yes. The anthropological reflection is very important to understand what we are talking about, not just linguistics. Because we're all concerned about the linguistic aspect when we talk about AI. You say, well, what do you mean by AI? And when we talk about improving the human being, what do we understand by a human being? I think something that people were saying, you were asking about the importance of being surprised or being capable of surprise. Aristotle said that philosophy starts with admiration, fermatzein, with which leads us to this desire to know more. And this is what distinguishes us from animals, the desire to know, according to Aristotle. But between our wishes, the wish to know more distinguishes us, separates us from animals. And this begins with surprise. It would be interesting, I'm not going to do it here, but it would be interesting to see what role is played by surprise within transhumanism and as compared with other anthropologies, for example, the classical anthropologies, because there may be ways of understanding human beings where surprise has no place. There's some rationalistic visions or which have a vision of human beings which do not contemplate surprise. Which, that would be interesting to work on, right? I think it is interesting, but and you should work on it if you know. Can I make a brief contribution on dialogue? We need to consider that we have, in the question asked by the priest in the previous session, it is difficult to find common ground when there is an explicit rejection of all preceding philosophies. I am reading this in the philosophical manifesto of transhumanism that says that ancient traditions have nothing to say about the things that are really interesting. So, when there is no will to have a dialogue which would require accepting a series of concepts to altogether come to some common ground, it's very difficult to have a dialogue. So the possibility of finding some common ground is more related with finding the solution to specific problems, not so much to do with philosophy, but specific problems that are common to different philosophical perspectives or intellectual perspectives, and because of that shared interest might generate a certain dialogue. I can't see many other possibilities. I want to add my own comment. Elena was mentioning one of the titles of my book, which is What You Can't Talk About. And what you can't talk about, we keep talking about, right? The problem is translating it, finding that language, that common language. Only metaphysics can offer us that language, because we keep talking, we are obsessed with things that we can't talk about. Conscience, good or bad, or, God. This new conception of man that people are trying to impose on us has already rejected, without any type of criticism, talking about things that we must talk about, and we are obsessed with it. And Wittgenstein has this intuition that is what needs to be talked about. I'm going to be brief. My question is for Dr. José Ignacio Murillo. Talking about conscience, briefly, my question is whether transhumanists are clear that there is something in their conscience, because Raymond Kurzweil says that I think that the universe exists. The only thing I'm aware of is that I'm aware. So if we relate this with Boston, it says that we might be living a simulation. My question is, what do they know? What do transhumanists know? What are they aware of? Well, you're putting the nail on the, you're hitting the nail on the head. Precisely, they may incur contradictions and paradoxes. One of them is that if we end up considering that the brain, that any reality is a virtual reality, because reality is a product of the brain, or an image that is projected by the brain but has no bearing on reality. We know it's adaptative, but we don't know much about it. Then any other theory about the meaning of reality or improving things is really not feasible, because we are denying the possibility of knowing or of learning. And this is precisely what I wanted to say, because we are always presupposing that we know and that we are talking about reality. And this has many consequences. We need to consider it very profoundly, both from the point of view of what it means for the human being and from the metaphysical point of view. And only if we face up to that problem can we consider what it means to improve, what we can do, what we can't do, etc. So the weakness, the metaphysical weakness, well, it is also true that the tradition of what we call transhumanism within the posthumanist movement, what people call transhumanism, is a kind of a way of thinking that's very typical to the Anglo-Saxon world, which is a heavy tradition of understanding intelligence, and very reactive, which is very reactive vis-à-vis and very skeptical vis-à-vis metaphysics, and with a vision of knowledge that is rather limited. Precisely, it might reach the conclusion that thinking is just an association of ideas. And this, of course, constrains the way in which the transhumanist project is presented, this weakness of the metaphysical foundations, right? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our Q&A session. I want to make a brief summary. We have talked about the foundations of transhumanism, and we realized that transhumanism has no foundations, at least. It's just a set of ideas, sometimes paradoxical ones. It is more than a theory, it is more like a praxis. And this is something that has been mentioned. And the historical, cultural genesis, it's a new way of conceiving things, overcoming the human nature to move towards something else, but we don't know what it is. It's a kind of cloud, right? Sanders precisely speaks about taking the human mind to the cloud. And when we look at the roots that support transhumanism, we'll see that there's anthropology, which at some points is materialistic because it reduces human beings to genes and neurons, and at other points is idealistic because it reduces human beings as conscience, understood as a mental activity. The denial of that metaphysics sometimes is unknown. I think that, at least from what I've read in the last few years, there's no study on the classical foundations of philosophy. So, the way people understand human nature, the way they understand the body, and this would just, justify a Congress by itself. We have tried to paint a few brush strokes of what transhumanism understands by human, and we still have a lot to say, so I hope that this has served you. We are going to go deeper into this.
En conferencias magistrales, no me queda ya más que agradeceros y dar algunos avisos.
At 3:30, we will meet again. Now we're going to be having breakout sessions. This is the experimental science session.
En el salón de grados, que está en el edificio central. Lo tienen en el mapa que está en sus cuadernos. La comida de ponentes y moderadores va a ser en el centro deportivo, donde hemos tomado el café.
And then we're going to go where we had coffee. Then at the central cafeteria, well, you all have a ticket, a lunch ticket. You can pick up your tray and you can have lunch. Right, thank you very much, all of you, the speakers, for your interest. Have a good lunch and please be back at 3:30.
En el salón de grados. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Un aplauso.